Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to my talk today on the Underground Railroad in Indiana. My name's Jeannie Regan-Dinius, and I am a state employee, so I hope when you leave you feel like your tax dollars are doing something worthwhile. I work for the Department of Natural Resources, and many of you might think, well, why does DNR, who deals with nature, care about the Underground Railroad? Well, this stems from a law that happened in 1966. It's a federal law called the National Historic Preservation Act. And this federal law was dealing with lots of buildings in our cities being torn down using federal funds, and this was a way to stop some of that destruction of our heritage. A part of this law required that each state create a state preservation office. And in Indiana, they put us in DNR. Some of our responsibilities make sense for us to be in DNR, and it's a great place to work. Some of our responsibilities include we have responsibilities to the National Park Service. We deal with cemeteries, grants to non-for-profits to do preservation of historic resources. We monitor archaeology in the state. And because of the responsibilities to the National Park Service, that's why we're doing Underground Railroad. And if you stay to the end, it'll all make sense. I'll tie it all back together. Now, when I do talk about my office, I'm going to say DHPA, because DHPA is easier than the Department of Natural Resources Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology. So just know if I say that it's my office. So they gave me about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, to talk about 300 years of history. And so I am not going to be able to talk about every person, place, or event related to slavery in the Underground Railroad. But what I hope I can give you is the type of person who may have participated, the types of things they may have done, and some of the stories that are around the state and how we know about those things. But before I can talk about Underground Railroad, the first thing I need to do is talk about some slavery. I don't know if you've ever seen this drawing before, but this is the ideal way to ship your cargo, people, from the western part of Africa. That's where the vast majority of people who would be enslaved in the United States would come from. Most of them were kidnapped. There were some who were put into slavery in other ways, but the vast majority were kidnapped and put on a ship like this. They are lying on platforms, so it's basically a platform of people, because slave traders didn't make any money if their cargo didn't survive. And so this was supposed to be the best way to get them across the Atlantic to the New World and have them survive. But I will tell you that so many people died on these ships that the sharks used to follow the ships as they sailed across the ocean. They would come to the New World, and every part of what we call the New World, so from Canada all the way down to Argentina and everywhere in between, allowed for slavery. So don't think of this as just a southern United States thing, but this is actually a world topic, and that could be another topic for another day to talk about world slavery. Today we're going to focus on North America, specifically United States slavery. Now, as being an enslaved person, you had no control over your life. So you had no control of where you lived, who you lived with, who you married, who you had children with, your job. And the most important thing is that that we'll be talking about throughout is that you were never paid for your labor. So think about some of the things I'm going to talk about of how people handled, how fugitive slaves would handle a situation, and think to yourself, well, where'd they get that money? And that's a part of this whole system that we're going to be talking about today. The other thing to remember is that these individuals were bought and sold as property, like we would buy and sell a horse today. And so as historians, we need to think about the resources, the documents to look into as property, because that's going to give us more information. These individuals were bought, but most people couldn't just afford to purchase a person. Kind of like today, you can't just afford to buy cash for a house. So what do? You mortgage your house, right? Well, they had mortgages out on individuals. You insure your property, they insured their property. And there were lots of companies that would insure enslaved people. Part of that insurance was if there was an escape. And so looking through insurance records is very important as we look about how many people escaped and how many people were returned and what kind of value there was to that. And so for all of these reasons, a person who was enslaved might find the courage, might take that time in order to escape. Now, we need to talk a little bit about Hoosiers first. Now, if you talked to most Hoosiers of this time period and you asked them, was slavery wrong? They'd say, yeah, probably. And then never think about it again. It's not something that they worked into their daily lives. It's not something that they participated in. It was just there. There were then some people who would go to meetings, like this anti-slavery meeting up in LaPorte County, way up in northern Indiana, where you would go, you would listen to someone talk about the evils of slavery, maybe a preacher, minister. You might write letters to the editor to get them in the newspaper to convince other Hoosiers that slavery was wrong. You might write letters to your congressman to have them to try to end slavery. All of these people who are doing this type of work towards the legal end of slavery are called abolitionists. Now, just because you're an abolitionist does not mean that you're willing to step over that line and do the work that is necessary for Underground Railroad, which is illegal work. Now, the word slave and slavery is not in the U.S. Constitution, but there are 10 provisions dealing with it. And the first law that allowed for the recapture of a fugitive slave was signed in 1793 by George Washington. So a slave in Kentucky coming to Indiana could be captured, arrested, and then sent back all legally. And so there were people who were trying to end this slavery through legal forms, and they were abolitionists. The people who were willing to help that fugitive slave who was breaking state and federal laws, they too were breaking state and federal laws by trying to help this individual escape. And then you might find somebody like a colonizationist. Now, a colonizationist might be anti-slavery, might actually be an abolitionist, might be working towards the legal end of slavery, actually might even be an Underground Railroad person. But they did not want blacks living in this country. So their idea is that we'd free the slaves and then send them back to Africa. This American Colonization Society was created. They bought land in Africa, the country of Liberia today. It still exists today. That land was purchased by the Colonization Society and created as a colony for freed slaves who went back. Indiana had a colonization society, and Bloomington had a colonization society. So you had Bloomington individuals who were abolitionist activists involved with the university, involved with the Masons, involved with the creation of the city, who were also involved with colonization. And so it's not as simple to say, well, they're anti-slavery, so that meant that they're pro-black and are willing to do something illegal. There's too many differences of people, and there's lots of gray areas that we need to work through. Now you're a slave and you decide it's time to leave. You've had one too many beatings, your children have been sold, and you're not going to let them be sold to another plantation. One too many something said you're going to leave, so you run. You will be chased. You are property, you are valuable property, and you will be chased. Bounty hunters are there. They are in the communities of the plantations, plantation farm, kind of the same thing. The average number of enslaved people on a farm was 7, so don't think of Gone with the Wind and that size of farms and plantations, things like that. These were individuals, small farms, 3 and 4 enslaved people working on the farm alongside the family. But the bounty hunters then lived within the communities. They would get a contract. So if I were a slave owner and one of my slaves ran, I would put out a contract for a bounty hunter to then go find these individuals. Made more money as a bounty hunter than you did as a farmer. It was adventuresome. It was lucrative, and it was legal because, again, there were state and federal laws that made that work legal. So you knew that you were going to be chased, and then when you came into Indiana, you didn't know who was going to help you or who was going to turn you in because there were reward ads in the newspapers. If you read the newspapers from this time period, you'll find things from people from Kentucky, Tennessee saying, my slave Sam ran away, and this is what he looks like, and I'll give you $1,500 for his return. It's about $30,000 in today's terms. So think about that. You're a Hoosier farming in the middle of Monroe County, and all you have to do is turn someone in who you do not know, who is breaking state and federal laws, and who you probably have some racial opinions about. And so it was very easy to turn them in, get the money, and so not every Hoosier was going to be that one that was going to be willing to help find the next place, go to the next area. But you could come to Indiana. We're a free state, right? Well, sort of. The Northwest Ordinance, which created the Indiana Territory, said no slavery northwest of the Ohio River. But I can find people enslaved. If you go to Vincennes, Indiana, So if we're going over into this area over here into Knox County, it's where the territorial capital was. There were slaves there. If you go, when we became a state in 1816, our state constitution says no slavery in Indiana, but we have lots of incidences that prove Hoosiers were not paying attention to that law. The first one is 1820. First law, 1820, that was broken. It was and a woman was looking for her freedom. Her name was Polly. She was enslaved in Vincennes, and she found a local lawyer who would take her case. This case went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court ruled, yes, you're being held as a slave, you are free. So Polly went back to Vincennes, and we can prove 5 years later she was still being held as a slave, because the guys in Vincennes didn't care about the guys in Corydon, which is where the first state capital was and where the Supreme Court was ruling. They didn't care about their rulings. So we can prove that we did have blacks enslaved in Indiana. But we also had free blacks in Indiana. We had lots of free black settlements around the state. Some things to remember about their lives: they couldn't vote, couldn't serve in the militia, couldn't send their children to school. And the most important law related to what we're talking about is they could not testify in a case where a black or a white person was a party. So somebody from Kentucky comes into Indiana and accuses you of being their slave. You can't testify on your own behalf. And so who always wins? The slave owner, right? And so what happens is there are actually letters from the Indiana governor to the Kentucky governor saying, "Will your citizens please leave our citizens alone?" Because there were so many cases of these, we call them man-stealing cases in Indiana. So we do know in Indiana we had free blacks. We do know we had slaves. Another way that we had slaves, whether if they just ignored the issue of the law, is if I was down on the Ohio River and I lived in Jeffersonville, and I could go across to Louisville and talk to a farmer there and say, hey, I need some people to work my land. You send over 5 guys, they work my land, I pay you. That's slavery. And then the other way is an indentured servant. Now, most of us think of indentured servants as someone from England or Ireland who couldn't afford to come to the New World. And so they would put out a contract, someone would pay their transportation over, and then they would work off that transportation fund and their room and board through an indentured servant. Indiana's a little bit different. The law first started when we were a territory and then went on when we were a state of indentured servants. And it basically said that it's the introduction of Negroes and mulattoes into the state. It allowed for you to purchase somewhere else. So go down to Kentucky, you could purchase someone, bring them back to Indiana, and make them be an indentured servant. The contract was as long as you made it be, and the contract followed the children of the enslaved person. So my children would then be enslaved and their children would be enslaved or indentured. So it's slavery, we just don't call it that. So again, Indiana had free blacks, we had slaves, and we had fugitive slaves. The first fugitive slave case that I'll talk about is from Peter. Now Peter is living in Kentucky in 1821. He leaves. I have no idea what happened to Peter, where he was, but in 1824, he ends up in Richmond, just outside of Richmond, over in Wayne County. So if you don't know your geography, right over in this area here. All right, so Peter shows up there, living his life. He's bought some land, he's farming, and he is just trying to be a Hoosier. Well, the bounty hunter, and I'm fascinated with the bounty hunters, how they know things. Of all the places they could go in the United States, they came to Indiana. All the places in Indiana they could go, Richmond, which was not that big at that time, and waited for Peter outside the store where he shops. When Peter comes in, he's arrested, and he's taken to the jail because Indiana said, okay, fine, you can extradite that person back to the slave state, but there's a process. And so part of that process was that the owner had to identify him. So Peter goes to jail, and we wait because the bounty hunter has to go back to Kentucky, get Peter's owner, and bring him back. Well, while we're waiting, and this is what the court case says, a violent mob of Quakers, which I love because we think Quakers are all passive, but apparently this mob, well, my mob is 2 people, a gentleman and his son-in-law, break Peter out of jail. They beat up the jailer. They break Peter out of jail. Peter's gone after that. We don't know what happened to him. We hope that he found some freedom. But then what you have left, you have my two Hoosiers, my two Quakers. What do you do with them? Well, that 1793 law that I told you George Washington signed was not a criminal case, but a civil case. And so the bounty hunter and the owner of Peter sued these gentlemen for loss of property, no different than if they had stolen his wagon. And so they went to the court, and they were found guilty, and each were asked or told that they had to pay $1,500. So in 1825, Peter's owner got $3,000 for the inconvenience of his loss of property. So again, remember, Indiana, free state, but free blacks, slaves, and fugitive slaves all living here amongst the white Hoosiers. Now, when you see this map, you'll see some semblance of this map in every book, website, exhibit that you see. I hate this map, and when I get done explaining to you why, you too will hate this map. This map was started by a professor from Ohio State University, and he, in the 1860s and 1870s, started writing the postmasters in the United States, asking them about the Underground Railroad in their community. Well, who is the postmasters in the United States in the 1880s? They're white, and they're male. So this tells me about what white men knew about what other white men were doing. And I know this because the Indiana records still exist. You can go to the Indiana State Library, and on microfilm they have the letters back and forth, because a postmaster would write Professor Siebert back and say, you need to talk to John. And then Professor Siebert would write John, and John would write back and talk about his things and say, okay, also talk about Jim and Fred. And so you have all of these letters. So we can read them, and it appears from the letters that women were not involved at all, and that blacks were not involved at all. But lots of evidence proves otherwise, that women were there alongside their husbands, helping with medical care, when someone came to stay at the house, fed them, clothed them. When husbands weren't home, they were helping that way. And we have lots of evidence of African Americans participating. So it's a good start of a map, but it's not a complete map. Second reason I hate this map is it implies routes. That every time you came into Madison, Indiana, you had to go to Columbus. There was no other place to go because the route says so. Well, if you think about over the time period, people move, people die, people stop participating. Roads, you think the potholes are bad today? Imagine in the 1840s with just dirt roads. So bridges are out, lots of snow. And then those bounty hunters. Bounty hunters did not make any money turning in people participating on the Underground Railroad. They made money capturing fugitive slaves. So they were figuring out who was helping, and they were staking out their houses. So if I always go to you, but this time we know there are bounty hunters outside your house watching, why would we go that way? We wouldn't. We're going to go this way. So think of it not as straight lines, but a web of potential paths that could get you in a variety of different directions. You didn't always necessarily go north. Sometimes you had to go south in order to get back up north again, or east and west. So think of it as, again, just a web of potential paths. And then the third reason I hate the map is that it just implies everyone is working at the same time. And we know, because of settlement patterns and people dying, things like that, that some people are more active in some areas, but not in other areas, and things like that. But it's a good start of a map. And we started with this map when we started doing our research, and have just blown it up to other potential areas. Now, if you're going to find freedom, you have to go to Canada, right? Not necessarily. If you're living in Georgia, does it make more sense to go to Canada or Florida, where the Seminole Indians are in conflict with the U.S. government and are fine to allow these individuals to come into their tribe? If you're in Texas, make more sense to go to Canada or Mexico? Mexico ended their slavery in 1826, and so they allowed fugitive slaves to come into Mexico, become Mexican citizens, and be free. You could go to the western part of the country that hadn't been fully settled yet. And then one of my favorite places is Alaska. When I heard Alaska had an Underground Railroad initiative, I thought, that is the longest walk ever. But if you look at their research, it's quite fascinating. The ships would come in, the whaling ships would come in to the ports of New Orleans, New York, because New York, the the colony of New York allowed for slavery. And so at that time period, they would come into New York or Massachusetts and sell their wares and their goods from the whaling season, and then slaves would hop on board and just sail away. Sometimes they stayed on those ships as sailors, but other times they went all the way up to Alaska and got off there. And so there are descendants of runaway slaves in Alaska today. So don't always think Canada. But we like Canada in Indiana because if they're going north, then they're probably going to come through Indiana, and maybe they came through Bloomington. So if you're going to come through Indiana, the first thing you got to do is get across that Ohio River. Now, there are multiple ways across it. You can swim across it. You could steal a rowboat, row across. You could have somebody from Kentucky who would row you across. And my favorite person is a gentleman named Freeman Anderson, who was in the area across the river from Hanover College. And we know that he worked for about 13 years, and he would row people across, watch them get out and run towards freedom, and then come back. The interesting thing about him, he himself was enslaved. So something about his life kept him there. But the other interesting thing is that we have found is actually the start of the Underground Railroad started on the plantations. It's, I don't have the what it takes to run, but you do. I'm going to make sure you have as much time before they notice you're gone as possible. Slaves come, somebody comes through our plantation and they're not from our area, and we're going to help them get directions to the next going north to continue that. And so that help from the enslaved community was really the start of the Underground Railroad. Other ways you could get across the river, somebody from Indiana could row across and pick you up. And we have lots of examples up and down the river from Evansville to Aurora and everywhere in between. And then you could take one of these ferry boats. These ferry boats were active between Louisville and New Albany and Jeffersonville, and there are passes that were required. Slaves, in order to be off plantation, had to have a pass. The pass would say their name, their owner's name, dates, where they're supposed to be, because a lot of slaves did business for their owners. But if I'm walking down the road and a patrol stops me, which is local citizens who've taken it upon themselves to make sure any African American has their pass, then you might get I might have to show my pass. So there are lots of complaints in the papers in Louisville that the ship, these ferry boat ships, the crew and the captain aren't asking the slaves for these passes. And so someone could get on board, come across to Indiana, which was not uncommon. They were doing business over in New Albany, things like that. But if they didn't have a pass, they didn't have permission, then they could just kind of continue going north. We don't know if the ship and the captain and the crew were sympathetic, whether they didn't care, they had other things to do like run their boat, or whether they were being bribed. But for whatever reason, there were a lot of concerns about that in the Louisville papers about that. So again, you're going to get across by swimming, a boat. The last way is walking. Now, I'm not crazy. That the river today is not the Ohio River of the 1800s, the 1850s. We've changed it enough that it's changed things. So in the summer, it used to dry up enough that you could wade across in areas. There were sandbars and things like that, so you could just walk across the river. And in the winter, at least 3 times that we know of, it froze solid, so it became an ice bridge. And during those times, we know plantation owners actually moved their enslaved people farther south to get them away from the ice bridge. But no matter how you do it, you got to get yourself across that river so that you can start going north. Now, I'm going to start talking about some people, some Hoosiers, who participated and show you kinds of things that they were doing. This is Levi Coffin, the most notorious, well-known, popular Underground Railroad individual in Indiana, the Hoosier. Not really a Hoosier, he's from North Carolina. He moves to Indiana through the Great Quaker Migration, builds his house just north of Richmond. And that's all I'm going to say about Levi, because there are tons of books. You can go to see his house. It's a state historic site. It's a part of the state museum system. And so you can go and read all about him. I'm going to talk about people that other people don't talk about. So you're going to come across in Madison. You're going to cross the river there. And what you're going to do is you're going to go into the Georgetown neighborhood. Now, the Georgetown neighborhood is the part of Madison that was the free black community. This is the free black neighborhood. And this is what we're finding, is that while the Underground Railroad started on the plantations, the Underground Railroad in Indiana started with the free black communities. And it makes sense if you think about it. I look like the people enslaving them. Why would a fugitive slave trust me? Because I say, honest, I'm here to help? Well, no. So they're going to come into this free black community. They're going to meet people who they may know, may be related to, have a connection with. The people in the free black community know who in the white community can be trusted. And so you have a lot of individuals doing work out of this Georgetown neighborhood. My favorite guy is lived in the house here, the middle house here. And Mr. Anderson was a blacksmith, and he was our Harriet Tubman. Now, when I talk to fourth grade teachers, I tell them about Harriet Tubman, an amazing character in U.S. history. She needs to be taught, but she never stepped foot in Indiana. So we can talk about what she did, which is she would go onto different plantations, organize groups off. Imagine waking up in the morning and everybody's gone. Okay. Well, William did the same thing. He would go off to the plantations in Kentucky, organize people, and then bring them out. He had a bounty on his head, wanted dead or alive. How did they know he was doing this? I have no idea. But they had a big bounty on his head, wanted dead or alive. 1841, we call it the Kentucky Mob. A group of Kentuckians come over to Madison to break up this Underground Railroad cell. They beat up some people, try to drown a few people in the river. Mr. Anderson decides it's time for him to leave. He moves north to eventually to Cleveland to work on that end of getting people over into Canada. But he keeps coming back to Kentucky to organize groups. And one of the times, unfortunately, he was captured. And I called him William. It's actually Elijah. I'm sorry, it's Elijah Anderson, not William. So William Anderson's another gentleman in Madison, but Elijah is the gentleman I'm talking about. And he is arrested. He's found in Kentucky. He's arrested for enticing a slave off the plantation, which was a Kentucky state law. He's found guilty. He went to the Kentucky penitentiary. How do I know this? His intake records are still at the Kentucky State Archives. So you can go to the state archives and read his intake, and which is amazing for in the genealogical portions in the 1840s. I know how tall he was, how dark he was, tattoos, whether he could read and write, things like that. Now, unfortunately, Elijah did die in jail. We're not sure how. All the records say from the system was that he died in jail. I have people tell me he was murdered, but there's no evidence of that. And there were other Hoosiers, other black Hoosiers, who were in the Kentucky penitentiary for breaking the same law. So I'm not quite sure exactly how he died, but that's kind of what happened to him. You might run into George de Baptiste, who was another free black in that community. He actually went up to Detroit, worked in Detroit after that Kentucky mob, helping people get over to Windsor from the Detroit area. Now you might come into New Albany. And when you come into New Albany, you're going to hit the Underground Railroad differently. Now I say it's Underground Railroad. It's not underground, and it's not a railroad. It's not a subway system. This is people helping people. It's giving them a place to stay, whether that's in your house, in the bed, on the floor, in your barn, back in your woods, and you're safe back there. Giving them food, medical attention, a change of clothes, and directions to the next house. It's that simple. I mean, it's not simple, but it's that simple. It's not these tunnels and hidey holes. There's actually only one documented tunnel in the entire United States, and that's in New York. And the hidey holes is what we call the false walls and things like that are not usually found in most of the houses. So it's people helping people. In New Albany, it's a tad bit different. It literally is the railroad. The first railroad in Indiana is from the Ohio River north to the state capital of Indianapolis. So imagine running from New Albany to Indianapolis or sitting on a train. Whether you're hiding in the baggage car, you're bribing someone to ignore that you're there, you buy a ticket and you pass as white. However it is you do that, think about how much easier it would be to run if you're literally on the train. And that actually changes the face of the fugitive. And what I mean by that is the early 1800s, 1820s, most of the fugitives are young men 18 to 25. My personal opinion why is they had the stamina, they had the attitude, and they didn't have their children that they were going to be dragging with them. By the time of the Civil War, because of things like the train, like the help of the Underground Railroad where people are getting assistance, we find 11 and 12-year-old girls by themselves running on the Underground Railroad. We have a woman in Decatur County who's caught with her 5 children. So it changes the face because they're getting help, making it an easier run instead of something that you have to do totally on your own. Now, if you come in to Evansville, you might run into Ira Caswell. Now, Ira is a conductor. Now, I say it's not the railroad, but we use railroading terms. And these are not terms that we came up with as historians. These are terms that they're using at the time period, that a conductor would move packages from station to station. And how they're using them are in letters. So somebody might send a letter and say, hey, I want to let you know in 3 days I'll be sending you some packages, just so you know you're going to receive 5 packages. So they're using things like that. So Ira is a conductor. So he's helping individuals find that next station, whether it's a ride in his wagon, use of his horses, or just directions. He's helping them find that next station, which is the next place to find food, rest, things like that. The other thing that Ira used to do is walk up and down the Ohio River looking for bounty hunters. Bounty hunters were staking out the Ohio River looking for the people crossing. And so if Ira found someone on the Ohio River who was a bounty hunter, he'd beat them up. Just a different thing to do. All right, now we're going to move over to Lancaster, which is north of Madison, and Eleutherian College. Now, don't think of this as a college like IU. This is, it says, starts as an elementary school. They have advanced classes later. The unique thing about this school, though, is that it educated men, women, whites, and blacks in the same classroom at the same time. In 1848, this is unheard of anywhere in the world except one other place. Does anybody know where? That's right, Union Literary Institute in Randolph County, Indiana. So in 1848, Union Literary Institute and Eleutherian College are on the forefront of education. Now, the people who built this college, who also were people who, as a community, were helping. Normally, when I talk about the Underground Railroad, it's 5 or 6 people total in a county for the entire time of the Underground Railroad. It's usually a family and maybe very, very close friends or in-laws and things like that, but that's it. Here in Lancaster, this group came from the Carolinas. They were Anabaptists and opposed to living around slavery, so they moved up here as a community and started working to make an Underground Railroad kind of enclave. The last time I talked to the researcher doing research in this area, she's up to 25 families, and some of those families is 5, 10, 15 people. So it's a unique situation. But most places, it's a family here or there, a couple of people, and that's about it. One of the families working here in Lancaster are the Hoyts. Now, what I like about the Hoyts is family dynamics. So the daughter, and when she's in her 90s, started writing historians around the state and said, all right, I'm starting to see all these articles and newspaper articles about Underground Railroad, but you're not talking about my dad. Let me tell you what my dad did. And so she talked about some of the work that he did because she had encountered it. Had she not have told us about that, we wouldn't have known about it. Lyman died in 1958, so 1858. He died in 1858 before the war, and so we didn't know much about it. He didn't actually tell his children what he was doing. She came across it. She got up one night, went into the barn. There were 5 black men in the barn. He stopped her and prevented her from kind of leaving, and then told her what he was doing. Now think about your children and the things they tell strangers in the grocery store. And for that reason, most people don't share their Underground Railroad stories with their children until they're old enough to basically keep their mouth shut. And so we have lost a lot of these histories because of that, because they didn't share it with their family, passed away, never talked about it after the war, things like that. But the Hoyts, someplace that we were able to get this story because of his daughter, sneaking out of the house one night. Now, if you go all the way up to Marion, you can run into the Weaver settlement. The Weavers is a free black community. They actually have a strong oral tradition of Underground Railroad activity, but unfortunately, we don't find a lot of primary documents to support their stories. And we need that both. We need the oral traditions and the primary documents in order to get a full history, because this history is very much steeped in myth and legend, and so we want to make sure that what we're saying is correct and accurate, and sometimes oral traditions can get changed by people as they're telling the story. And so we're working with this community in order to find more documents to prove some of the stories that they have. Now, if I go all the way up to northern Indiana to Orland, this is where my first Hoosiers are arrested under a new law. The 1793 law I told you about didn't have much teeth. It was civil, not criminal. There's some other things going on in the country with where slavery is going to be, what new states are going to come into the Union as slave states or free states. We get the Compromise of 1850. A part of that is the new Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, made helping an individual escape slavery a criminal offense and jail time and penalties. And so the first Hoosiers arrested under this law are up in Orland. They're arrested up there. There's 5 Hoosiers. They're arrested for helping Tom, Tim, and Alfred. How did Tom, Tim, and Alfred get from Kentucky all the way up to Orland? We have no idea, but that's where they're caught. My 5 Hoosiers go on trial. 3 of them are found not guilty for a variety of technicality issues with their warrants and things like that. 2 of them actually go to trial. One is found not guilty. The other, Benjamin Waterhouse, he's found guilty of violating the Fugitive Slave Law 3 times for helping Tom, Tim, and Alfred. He could have gotten decades in jail and thousands of dollars of fines. The judge gave him a $30 fine and 30 minutes in jail. So we're actually looking at the judge now and seeing what kind of other activities following the law, but he's clearly anti-slavery and against these laws that are being passed. Now this is the house of one of the gentlemen, this Captain Barry. He's one of the gentlemen found not guilty in this case, and it's a beautiful farmhouse, isn't it? It's just gorgeous. Well, this is what it looks like today. It's a mucked up 8-apartment mess that it says nothing about Underground Railroad. So if you call me and say, hey, this house in Bloomington or this house in Martinsville was on the Underground Railroad, I'm going to say, great. Who lived there? Because it's actually the people who lived there that did the work. And there's going to be nothing about the building that's going to scream Underground Railroad. Because again, those hidey holes, those are myths. And so it's just somebody lived in this house and decided to allow individuals into their home and help them find freedom. And so unfortunately, a lot of the homes look like this or they're torn down. So what we're looking at is the genealogy of the people, were they likely to participate, and then proving they participated. My people tell me all the time, you can't prove this. It was secret. Well, it wasn't as secretive as we would like to think. So up in Huntington, Indiana, I'm reading the newspapers, looking for some information, and I find a letter to the editor. Reverend Chamberlain is running Negroes through his home, and someone should do something about it. So clearly his neighbors knew what he was doing, and passive-aggressively just wrote a letter to the editor. A lot of the court cases that we see of people being tried for helping fugitives, they're actually being, their neighbors are the ones turning them in. And it's very odd things. Now, the one in Huntington, it's in the urban area. Reverend Chamberlain lives downtown, so the next door neighbors are going to see it. Some of these individuals, though, it's out in the farm. The neighbor lives 2 miles away and notices they're bringing extra wood into the house, and that was odd. Or noticed that they were taking food into the barn, and that seemed odd, which is why they turned them in. So it's a very odd kind of, looky-loo on each other's neighbors and stuff like that. But that's where that is happening. So it's not as secretive as a lot of people think that it is. And sometimes, though, we have to move counties. Because what I'm looking for primary source-wise is not in the county I'm looking for, and the Wabash Huntington is a great example. The Huntington County newspaper editor was pro-South, which meant he felt it was the South's right to own slaves. It was none of our business up here in the North, us rabble-rousers that we were, to do anything about it. So he never had any positive articles in the paper about Underground Railroad or anti-slavery and abolition or anything like that. The Wabash County editor was anti-slavery. And so there was actually a rally in Huntington County. 200 people showed up for it. It was an anti-slavery rally. And it was not covered in the Huntington paper. It was only covered in the Wabash paper. So we have to get out of our county boundaries because they did. And that's sometimes is the only way we're going to find the resources that we're looking for. Now, if you go up here, does anyone know what the blue area is? Right? It's the Great Kankakee Marsh. This is it's swampy land, marshy land all up through there. There are no roads through there till the 1850s, not a lot of settlements. So we don't get a lot of organized efforts through there. We know that fugitives used the grassland and the swamps as places to hide, but did that on their own, not as an organized thing with settlers. But where you do get stuff is just south of Chicago. There's a community there over in Illinois that is pretty active, and they are running individuals across the dunes and across the Great Lakes. And where they're going to is actually not South Bend, but just north of South Bend in Cass County, Michigan, called Cassopolis. Because originally, they didn't go to Canada, they were just going up to Michigan. Well, eventually, the bounty hunters realized, well, if they're just going to Michigan, that's the United States, I can legally go get them. They could not extradite them out of Canada. Canada would not allow the extradition of fugitive slaves out, but Cass County could. So what happens is we have a lot of captures or kidnappings, depends on whose side of the story you're on, but we get a lot of captures and then bringing them south. Well, if they're coming south, we call this the reverse Underground Railroad, you get a lot of stuff in Indiana. And we're getting a lot of cases that way where people are coming back south and individuals are instigating and they're getting involved in order to try to free the enslaved individual from the bounty hunters. And so we're getting lots and lots of cases that way, so it's kind of fun. All right, then we get James Washington. He lives in South Bend. He's a barber by profession. He's a conductor. I talked about that. The last thing I have is a solicitor. I don't know if you noticed a couple of times I said some things like you could be on the boat and bribe the captain, or you could be on the train and bribe someone and not know that or buy a ticket, things like that. How does someone who's been enslaved all their lives buy a ticket? They've never been paid for their labor. Or if they get to Michigan or even to Canada, you can't just drop them off and say, have a nice life. How do they buy food, clothing, land, anything to start a life? And so there's a whole group of people who are raising funds. Washington was very active and engaged with the fugitives themselves, but he also worked with the Bartletts. This is their home. It still stands in South Bend, but we don't think a fugitive ever came through the house, but Mrs. Bartlett was quite active in raising funds. She annoyed her friends so much they complained about her in their diaries because every time they came over to the house, she was asking money for the fugitives. We found a receipt for 200 pairs of work boots in her records. That woman never wore a pair of work boots in her life. So with all the evidence we have, what we're assuming is then those work boots went to the fugitive communities up in Canada because people needed new boots. After you run from Kentucky or Tennessee to Canada, you're going to need a new pair of shoes. And so a good pair of work boots is an essential. So you have a lot of that type of philanthropy work that's necessary in order to make the Underground Railroad work. All right, now I'm going to simplify the Civil War, or the cause of it, to 3 events, just to make it a quicker thing here. So the first is Dred Scott. Now, Dred is enslaved. He's living in a part of the United States that's not supposed to have slavery, and so he finds a lawyer, and the lawyer takes his case. This goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court rules not only is he still a slave, he had no right to sue because blacks are not citizens of this country. Did not say enslaved people, it said blacks. We're going to deal with that later. And then also said Congress had no right or authority to say which states would be slave states or not. So these lines and things like that were illegal. It was not a popular decision by any of the abolitionists and anti-slavery people, and one of the most important ones was John Brown. Now, John is living in what we call Bleeding, Kansas, and we call it Bleeding, Kansas is because they're skirmishing before the Civil War on whether Kansas is going to come in as a slave state or a free state. So John thought the only way to end slavery in the United States was violently, like it had done in the revolutions and the rebellions in Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, places like that. So his goal was to go to Harper's Ferry, it's a federal arsenal in Virginia, steal the guns, give them to the slaves of Virginia, and let them do what they're going to do. He came to Indiana to recruit. Now, normally when you see anything about, it's always John Brown and his boys. Well, yes, John Brown and his boys went, but other people went with him. Fugitive slaves from Canada came back, both men and women. No Hoosier that we know of, we know that no Hoosier went with him, but we don't know if any of them donated money because he held 2 meetings, one in Indianapolis and one down in Madison in that free black community that I showed you early on. We don't know who attended, but we don't know if any money was given towards that for him to fund it. So he went out to Harper's Ferry, tried the revolt, tried the raid, was caught and executed. And then we have Lincoln's election. Now, when Lincoln first started running for president, he said he had no intentions of ending slavery. It was not why he was running, and so that was not an issue. Well, the South didn't believe him, and so he's elected in November of 1860, and in December of 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union, fires on Fort Sumter, and by February 4th, 1861, we get the Confederate States of America, the South. So in the war, we get the Civil War. Congress abolishes slavery in D.C. and the territories, and Lincoln offers the South a plan. Now, this first plan was just come back into the Union, we won't try anybody for treason or anything like that, and we'll gradually emancipate all slaves, but the federal government will compensate you for them. So your slaves will all be freed eventually, but you'll get your money for it. South didn't want anything to do with that plan, and so the war continues. So in September of 62, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. That, along with some federal laws, did not free all the slaves. I know that's what we're taught in school, but it wasn't that simple. What the Emancipation Proclamation said is any state or part of state in rebellion against the United States, their slaves are free. So think about that for a minute. Lincoln's telling people who are in states who don't think that they're a part of the United States anymore and that he's not their president, that their slaves are free. That only works when we're in control. So as the Union armies starts moving across the South, then starts taking control of areas, individuals are freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. The last group freed by this was in Galveston, Texas, June 19th, 1865. If you know anything about your war history, the war was over in April. It just took that long to get the troops down there and get everything settled and stuff like that. And so then after that, we don't need the Underground Railroad anymore, right? Well, not quite. It said states in rebellion against the United States. There are 5 states, parts of states or territories that were slave-holding, but a part of the North. And the closest one to Indiana is Kentucky. And so if you think about, so Kentucky never seceded from the Union. So there were some Kentuckians who fought on the side of the South, but the government never seceded from the Union. And so their slaves were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was one of these things that it was like an aha moment for all of us, and we're like, oh, we're all a bunch of idiots. We should have known this beforehand and thought about it. And so we started looking for Underground Railroad activity after the Emancipation Proclamation. And we found some. Hannah Tolliver's 1864 is a Hoosier, and she is arrested in Louisville for helping 5 men try to find freedom. So this is more cases that we are finding even after the Emancipation Proclamation because of our proximity to Kentucky and their continued slavery. So now we need to change the U.S. Constitution with the war being over. So the 13th Amendment makes slavery illegal in the United States. The 14th Amendment makes anybody born in the United States a citizen. And this is something we deal with today, but that stems from that Dred Scott case because they ruled blacks were not citizens of the country, not enslaved people. So that's for that to fix that issue. And the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. So now we don't need the Underground Railroad anymore, and so the historians step in. We get the first historian doing most of the work, Wilbur Sieber, professor in the 1890s. He writes this, the Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom. He's the one who made this horrible map that you all now hate. Anybody read his book? Yeah, it's not a great read. It's a little dry, but it's a good start, okay? Then we get William Still. He's an African-American out of Philadelphia. He actually recorded not recorded like tape recorded, but he kept notes of all of the people who came through his house and then wrote a book called The Underground Railroad. Anybody read it? Yep. Levi Coffin, he wrote Reminiscences, where he talks about himself being the president of the Underground Railroad and things like that. Anybody read that? This is the most common book that most Hoosiers will have read since he was living here. Okay. And then in 1961, Larry Guerra writes The Liberty Line, which was groundbreaking at the time. This is how we do research today. Basically, what it said is we should look at everybody, which is a novel idea, not just white Quakers, because that's what everybody was looking at before. So you have all these historians who've written these books, but nobody read them. Anybody read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Yeah, it's a common book to read. It's fiction. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe's family were prominent abolitionists. She knew people. She knew the Coffins. She knew lots of people. She knew Frederick Douglass. So she would take a story from this person and a story from that person and a story from that person, and she wrote a journal, an article for a journal magazine. It was so popular that she wrote the book. The book became so popular, it became a play. The play became so popular that eventually when we got movies, it became a movie. But it's all fictionalized, it's aggregated, kind of combined together, and it's sensationalized. So in the book, Eliza's crossing the river. She's crossing the Ohio River with her child, and it's a raging river with icebergs. Now, I told you the Ohio River froze, but it was never a raging river, and it didn't have icebergs that she got to hop from iceberg to iceberg. So she took a true thing and just made it more grandiose to sell copies and things like that. But this is what most people know, because everybody read it, everybody's seen the play, the book, whatever, and so these are the myths that we get. The other thing that I love about it is that people, and you'll find these articles in the paper, every county in Indiana, every person in those counties is reading the same chapter, page, paragraph, and they're all seeing their community as the one being talked about. And so they'll be like, oh my God, look, page 42, that's us. And that's us in every town and around. So much so that she actually wrote a book called The Keys to Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she said who she used as her examples. And people said, oh, she's just lying. It's still us. So that's where we get most of our myths. Those are the myths we're trying to fight against: the hidey holes, the tunnels, the raging rivers, and things like that, and looking more towards a straight history, an accurate history, and a documented history. Now, after Larry Guerra's book, not much happens on research until 1998. In 1998, Congress mandated the National Park Service to create a park like a Gettysburg for the Underground Railroad. Well, they decided that there was so much research that needed to be done. The research had to be done at the state level, that they really didn't want to do a park, but what they did instead was this National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Basically, it's a listing of every person, place, and event, also collections of materials related to the Underground Railroad. They challenged each state. Remember at the beginning, I said we had responsibilities as a state preservation office to the National Park Service. So they challenged all of us. And I am happy to say Indiana was the only one at the time to pick up the challenge because there was no funds attached. So our director at the time said, yes, this is an important part of our history. Let's do this. He hired a young woman to help start it. And they started also a committee. This committee has grown so much, it's become its own non-for-profit. It's called the Indiana Freedom Trails. And so there are people in there who are concerned with one house, a type of religious organization, a county. They're doing their research, we're doing our research, and together what we're trying to do is just put together a more complete history of Indiana. Now, if you're interested in more, wanting to know more stories, things like this, you can always go to our website. We have lots of these stories online. But I've also got some books that I'm going to definitely encourage the library here to make sure that they have copies of. And these are like great reading. They're well documented and great reads. So one of them is Beyond the River by Anne Hagedorn. Great book. A lot of Indiana is in. She has a lot of Indiana stuff in here. Homeless, Friendless, and Penniless. So during the 1930s, in order to put people back to work, one group that the WPA put back to work were historians and oral historians, things like that. They interviewed former slaves. And these are the people who had been enslaved someplace else but were living in Indiana in the 1930s. So it's a great book. And then the other one is Bound for Canaan. Again, the author who did this research did a lot of research in Indiana, so there are a lot of Indiana stories in here. But just a great read, give you a good overview history of the Underground Railroad. So I hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and you're always more than welcome to connect with our office, also the library here in their genealogy room, in order to learn more about the Underground Railroad in not only your county, but the entire state. Thank you.